Western Reserve University School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. This is the All Access Med School Admissions Podcast. Hello again, everybody. I'm your host, Christian Essman, and I'm the Senior Director of Admissions and Financial Aid here at the School of Medicine. It's great to be with you again. Hey, if you're on the path to becoming a doctor, and hopefully you are if you're listening to this, there's a 5-letter acronym that is eventually going to become a very big part of your life, and that's the USMLE. Now, commonly known as the boards or the STEP exams, the USMLE, or United States Medical Licensing Examination, is kind of a gauntlet every medical student and resident must pass to practice medicine in the United States. These exams are administered by the NBME, or National Board of Medical Examiners. But for many pre-meds, these exams can be shrouded in mystery, or some pre-meds aren't even aware of them at all, and that's okay. But what we do know is that they're high-stakes exams, and we definitely know that they're hard. But why is that? I mean, who actually decides what's on the test, and how do they ensure that it's fair? So today, we're going to go behind the scenes to look at the science behind medical assessments. And we're joined by two people who spend their days really looking under the hood of these assessments at the NBME. So I'm joined by Dr. Amanda Klauser, who is the Vice President of Psychometrics and Data Analysis at NBME. And in this role, Amanda leads the teams responsible for the psychometrics applied measurement, test design, survey, standard setting, and score reporting functions for NBME programs and their clients. A psychometrician by training, Amanda is dedicated to advancing research that supports fairness and equity in test score use, designing meaningful assessments of skills and behaviors, and providing actionable feedback to score users. A psychometrician by training with a doctorate from the University of Massachusetts, Amanda has been a fixture at NBME since 2013. She's widely recognized for her leadership in measurement science, but what really drives her work is a dedication to fairness and equity. She spent her career focused on designing assessments that provide actionable feedback and promoting transparency to ensure that healthcare assessments are as meaningful and innovative as possible. Now, joining Amanda, also with the NBME, is Dr. Dan Jurich, a measurement scientist by training with a doctorate from James Madison University. Dan leads the initiatives that ensure the USMLE remains high quality and relevant for students, educators, and licensing authorities alike. Dan is passionate about advancing research that strengthens medical education and enriches the actionable feedback assessments provide. He's conducted studies evaluating the validity of assessments used through the medical educational journey, including USMLE, in training, and board certification examinations. He's also collaborated with educators and organizations to evaluate the impact of curricular changes on student performance and to promote transparency in residency selection. In previous roles since joining the NBME in 2014, Dan managed teams of talented psychometricians whose responsibilities included directing operational assessment activities and research in service of the organization's mission to achieve optimal healthcare for all. So these are two really big experts in educational assessment. So we're going to jump right into it here with Dan and Amanda. Well, hey, Amanda. Hello, Dan. Great to have you here. Thanks so much for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. This will be fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so glad that your group reached out to me. This has been fun preparing for this conversation. And I think it will be a really interesting one, particularly for people who, as we've talked about in kind of our prep meetings, are not familiar with what the NBME is and what the USMLE examinations are. But we're going to get to that stuff in short order. But I want to start with you. The listeners just heard your bio that I read to them about your background and who you are and what you do. But talk a little bit more, Amanda, about what is a psychometrician?
Sure. Psychometrician is a scientist who specializes in measurement. So psychometricians have specialty training in psychology, statistics, and testing. And in the context of a testing company, we work with content experts to measure unobservable things. So a popular example as well, you don't need a psychometrician to measure your height, right? You have a ruler for that, but you would want a psychometrician's help to measure something unobservable like knowledge or skills, or in a psychology context, a personality trait or a factor like that. So psychometricians work with contact experts to measure things you can't see and to help design tests to make decisions about skills and knowledge.
Dan, can you talk a little bit more from your perspective, like maybe what psychometricians do and like what inspires one to go into this? Like, what is your background usually in math or psychology or?
Yeah, it's a great question, Christian, because I think, first of all, it's a very niche field to begin with. Very few people know about it. Even fewer go in and thinking early in their lives that I want to become a psychometrician. So usually you hear about it either through taking an assessment or being in a field that interacts with psychometricians. And so many, I think, discover it through being as part of psychology or education degrees. And then being a little more curious about, wait, how are these assessments, right? Amanda described these tools that are being used to capture these more unobservable traits. How are they being developed? How do we know they work? Do people just whimsically write them? And then as you get interested, you discover there's a whole field, a whole science dedicated to this concept of how do we develop an assessment that truly measures what it intends to measure. So just as my personal experience, I was a psychology major with a statistics minor, and psychometrics really is a great synergy between those two degrees to begin with. So I kind of got lucky and learned about psychometrics as I was progressing through undergrad and decided that's a great mix for me.
Amanda, did you have a similar background?
Similar, yeah. I was trained as a school counselor and did 2 years as a school counselor in a high school here in Philadelphia, and was the point person for all the people that had complaints about the Pennsylvania state tests that their children were forced to take. So I wound up going back to psychometrician school after that experience with a real fire in my belly about fairness and equity in testing.
Oh, cool. I want to get to that in a little bit. Before we go into what the NBME is and USMLE, can you talk a little bit more about standardized assessments in general? Like what goes into creating those and scoring those kind of tests? Dan, is this your area of expertise or is this Amanda kind of thing?
It's really both of ours. If you're a psychometrician, I mean, this is your bread and butter. How do we create assessments and what goes into them? Maybe I'll even take a step back and just emphasize, I'm sure your listeners understand the importance, but why does a psychometric degree even exist? And you can think of the importance of the stakes that we associate with assessments when you think of an admissions assessment into college, into medical school, or maybe even further, a licensure assessment like what some of the exams that we work on. When you're associating those types of outcomes with an assessment, you need to ensure that it's measuring what it intends to, as Amanda said, that it's doing it with fairness, that's accurately covering the concepts you want. So that's why the psychometrics degree exists. And in terms of standardized assessment, really psychometricians are involved throughout the process. And what might surprise your listeners is how much maybe goes in before we even start writing items for an assessment. So, for example, a lot of the foundational work involves defining what is your purpose of this assessment? What are you intending to measure and why? And when I say why, I mean, it is different if you create an assessment that's supposed to be for, let's say, specifically clinical skills. You're measuring clinical skills for licensure might be very different than developing an assessment if you're measuring those same clinical skills for more practice and providing readiness assessment in terms of developing those skills. Maybe I'll go to Amanda for more specifics. I set up the kind of foundation of what is occurring in terms of why psychometrics exists. But Amanda, do you want to talk about the specifics about developing a standardized assessment?
Sure. I think you started really nicely talking about how psychometricians play into the process and the value that that specialized knowledge provides when there are high stakes or any stakes associated with an assessment. And I think that the real role that psychometricians play is as facilitators, right? I don't have medical knowledge. I don't have SAT knowledge. I don't have high school English knowledge. But my training helps me to work with the different individuals who do have that knowledge to determine, okay, well, how do we really get at that clinical construct? What does it mean to be enacting communication as a medical student? How do we know if someone can do that, if someone has enough of that to be successful in that context? And I think that's really the backbone of standardized assessment, is a intermingling of measurement science with content expertise to make sure tests are designed to represent the appropriate content, the appropriate skills, whatever it is, the appropriate stuff in the right ratios to make sure that someone who gets a high score has a lot or enough of those things. And I think we'll get into figuring out how much is enough a little bit later in the conversation.
Yeah, Christian, maybe I'll just finish this topic up because I think we'll cover each part of what we would typically call the assessment cycle. So as Amanda said, I think quite eloquently, the psychometricians are involved in supporting the development of an exam, working with experts in the subject in the field they're trying to assess, in test development experts and other experts throughout the process. We talked a little bit more specifically about developing an assessment, but of course there's also writing the items piece, scoring those items, doing the statistics to ensure that the exam is measuring what it intends to, that it's doing it at the right difficulty, reporting the scores in an interpretable manner, and then continue to keep up with the field as it evolves. I mean, think about medicine. It evolves constantly, so that we're always evolving and monitoring our assessments to make sure it's targeted appropriately.
Yeah, like you said earlier, Dan, it's a good reminder that don't forget that, not that you forget it, but these are standardized tests are high stakes examinations, whether they're ACT, SAT, MCAT, USMLE, LSATs, that so much has gone into the development of them because there's so much writing on the results of them. And people like you are behind the scenes putting this stuff together. Do you want to talk a little bit about like the scoring conventions for like ACT and SAT and MCATs, and how are these scoring conventions created by psychometricians?
I can talk about that generally, and then maybe Dan can go into some specifics about USMLE. But scoring is one of the main places where we look for fairness in testing. It's one of the main places where we can say, okay, we know this test is doing a good job for all examinees because, and there are a couple of reasons there. First, our scoring might look a little different from program to program. There's a foundational concept that most high stakes exams use called item response theory. It's probably a bit in the weeds for this conversation. But ultimately, it lets you look at someone's answers to a test and estimate their ability on whatever the underlying construct is. So an application of statistical theory across all test takers removes the potential bias of a grader or an observer, which I think is a real important factor in preserving equity and fairness in this sort of assessment. Like I said, I came into the field with a fire in my belly about how the tests were biased and unfair, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about how we know that is not in fact the case for the content that we work with. But anyway, applying scoring metrics appropriately and equally across all examinees, using item response theory, and similarly reviewing the content after it's been seen by examinees in the scoring process helps us to identify any test questions that didn't perform as expected, came across maybe just too difficult or too easy. Believe it or not, you don't want a lot of tremendously easy or difficult questions on your test to get a sense of examinee performance. So those are certainly reviewed by content experts after administration. We should talk about what happens before questions even get in front of examinees, which is kind of not quite scoring, but very important. But we'll get back into test design after this, I think. Dan, you want to talk a little bit about USMLE scoring in particular?
Sure. I definitely also want to talk about USMLE item development too. But as Amanda said, let's wait on that. And I'll just, there's so many different approaches that you can take in scoring an assessment. I'm sure many of your listeners have taken various assessments that come back with all sorts of different information, some of which provide a single score, some of which provide a score, and then many what we would call sub-scores, which are scores that tell you how you performed in a specific content area, some with percentile rank, some with normative scores that say kind of where you performed relative to other groups, similar to a percentile rank. All of that is determined based on the purpose of the assessment. So what scoring approach you take will be tailored to the use case. And that's why you see exams like ACT, SAT, MCAT have different reports than something like a USMLE. And in USMLE, which I know we haven't really got into specifically what it is, but it is a licensing exam. And I think we'll talk a little more about its exact purpose and design. But it is a licensing exam. So our primary outcome is the pass-fail distinction. And so you'll see that while we do provide other information, when we design our assessments, when we design our reports, the primary purpose is to convey that information about whether an examinee met the standards for minimum competence in that assessment. In the USMLE, we have 3 exams. So in that specific field that the exam covers. And I know one of the purposes of this conversation is to sort of clarify some misconceptions. We hear often about this idea of grading on a curve. Christian, I know you had some questions about that. I want to be very clear that so grading on a curve, again, I think many people are aware of this, mostly from probably classroom grading, where say if a class doesn't do particularly well on assessment, on a quiz, an exam, or assignment, that the teacher will move down the grade necessary to, say, get an A or a B. That happens in assessments, right, where you get scores based on how others have performed. Well, so one of our scoring principles, to your question, Christian, is that we do not grade on a curve. Because for the USMLE, remember the primary purpose again is that medical licensure. Has someone demonstrated the minimum competence, and in this case, safe and effective medical practice? That doesn't change based on how other people performed, right? That minimum competence is minimum competence as determined by subject matter experts. We'll get into a little more about that later, but that doesn't change. It's not a relative concept. So we wouldn't want to say someone who's demonstrated minimum competence, they actually don't get to pass the exam because they're in the bottom X%. That's not fair. That's not how licensure exams should work.
So break it down, Dan. Everyone could pass if they had a high enough score.
Yes, I would say anyone and everyone performing at the level that's deemed necessary would pass, right? It should pass. So if it's 100% of our examinees, it's 100% of our examinees. Thanks for highlighting that, Amanda. I think it's important to say that because that's the difference here between some of these other assessments. And that's just highlighting the purpose, like how psychometricians and the purpose of the exam, how psychometricians would interpret the purpose of the exam and use that to inform their scoring procedures.
I think the point you make is it's interesting because I heard scoring questions like literally, what are we doing? Because I think that's pretty consistent across standardized tests. And you took it to feedback. So would this be a good place to talk a little bit about why, what the 3-digit scores mean for step 2 CK and step 3 and why there isn't one for step 1? For example, and differently than SAT or ACT, where there's not a cut score, but instead a broader reporting range.
Why don't I jump in here? And before we go on to that, to give context to people about the 3 exams that are administered by USMLE. So there's step 1, step 2, and step 3. So step 1 is usually taken after the second year of medical school. And it tests a medical student's knowledge of the basic sciences fundamental to the practice of medicine, like anatomy, biochemistry, pathology, pharmacology, physiology, and behavioral sciences. And it assesses a student's ability to understand and apply these concepts to clinical situations. All right. Then there's step two. So that's the second part of the three here. And step two is usually taken kind of after third year, sometime in the fourth year. And it tests a medical student's clinical knowledge, skills, and understanding of patient care, including diagnosis and management across various specialties. It assesses the application of medical knowledge to patient care, emphasizing clinical science, and includes topics like internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, OB-GYN, and psychiatry. All right, then step three, it usually is taken in the first or second year of residency. So after they've graduated from medical school, then they're going into residency trainings. And then here comes the third licensure examination, and it tests the ability to apply medical knowledge and clinical and scientific principles essential to and for unsupervised general medical practice, usually in the first or second year of residency. So these standardized tests, whether you've taken ACT, SAT, MCAT, they don't end after that. And even after the licensure examinations, once you get into, you've selected your career pathway in pediatrics or cardiology or radiology, or whatever, you have to continue to take board examinations for that specialty for the rest of your career. So do you guys now want to talk a little bit about the scoring conventions for particularly what we just mentioned, step one, which is pass-fail as of, I think, 2022, and CK, clinical knowledge step two, which is a numerical score?
Let me just reiterate something you covered, which is there is no singular curriculum to medical education. I'm guessing that's something you've probably covered a lot on this podcast. And so when certain schools take the exams does differ, but you gave a great highlight of the typical process. And I'll just mention that you said step three is in residency, and that's partially because you actually have to pass step one and step two CK to take step three, and B, for U.S. students, you have to have graduated medical school as well. That is not the case for step one and step two. Thus, they're taken more as part of the medical school curriculum. And yes, this all goes back to the idea I think I mentioned earlier about purpose driving the scoring conventions. So some of you might be familiar. I know Christian's very familiar with the USMLE. All three step exams used to have numeric scores. You would get the exam back. It would tell you generally how you did on the overall assessment. So each of the exams had a 3-digit score that ranged from 1 to 300. And that helped the students when they got their assessment back to understand generally of all the content covered on that assessment, how well did they perform? Again, the primary outcome was still that pass-fail. That's what's used by the state medical boards to make a licensing decision. But that numeric score was intended to provide some additional guidance on performance. The residency selection system, which I know we won't have time to really cover, but there's a process when you're transitioning from medical school to specialize in a field of medicine. You apply for residency. That process has evolved immensely across time, and particularly the volume of applications and the work necessary to select from the applicant pool has grown exponentially. And so the program directors who are typically reviewing the applicants have used the USMLE performance as a way to select students, sometimes using it as what we would call a filter, and saying that if a student doesn't have above a certain score, they shouldn't be interviewed, they shouldn't be considered for this program. That's what we would call a overuse of an assessment or a misuse of an assessment score, since our assessment isn't designed explicitly for that purpose, and we can't justify the evidence that we have for the assessment doesn't justify making distinctions on a single score point. If you look at some of our materials around our scores, you'll see us be very clear that there's always some level of error, especially as you move away from the passing standard, the point where we make that pass-fail distinction. So at the high ends of our scores, making a distinction between someone who, remember I said it's a 1 to 300, making a distinction between someone who is, say, a 265 and a 264, there's nothing there. There's nothing that you could say is meaningfully different from those two examinees. And yet the score, particularly step one, was being used in that sense.
I just want to jump in for folks listening, because that's very different than the experience of someone who has just taken the SAT or the ACT and applied to college, and then someone who is preparing for the MCAT. Those are selection exams, right, where the score differences are meaningful. There isn't the one point on the scale that is more important than others, which plays into the test design as well. So USMLE, like you said, Dan, is designed to make a pass-fail decision, which means on the back end, the items are targeted to a certain place, which is very different from a selection exam where the items are targeted across the scale, and those score distinctions, like you said, between a 250 and a 265 might be meaningful, whereas in the case of USMLE, they're not.
Yeah, I think that's a great contrast, right? And again, all about the idea of purpose driving the scoring conventions, or really any part of the assessment design. And so in step one, or Christian, did you want to jump in here too?
I just wanted to say, I remember those days when USMLE was numerically scored, and it created a lot of angst for medical students. And because it's a high stakes examination, because to your point, Dan, there was this, I don't know if it was, we heard about it, but you never really knew if residency programs were doing it or not, because nobody wanted to really say that, oh, we're using cutoff scores. But it was, kind of out there that you heard maybe they were. If you didn't have a 252, you weren't getting an interview. And so a lot of students at that time felt that getting a certain score would predict their career trajectory. And so when it moved to pass fail I think it was announced in 21 or 20 or something like that, but it was first administration was 2022. I think that it still creates it creates some angst, but not to the level that we saw prior to the move from pass-fail or from numerically scored to pass-fail. I think that's taken down the temperature a little bit.
Appreciate that. And I'll say there's still a lot of work to be done in the residency selection space. And so you mentioned we did decide to transition step one from a scored exam to report only the pass-fail, right? And so you mentioned part of the goal was to bring down really the overemphasis of that exam in the selection process and in the determination of a student's future career, because one exam score never fully captures someone's full holistic picture. Mm-hmm. And so part of the testing organization's role is to look at how their exams are being used and to potentially make these decisions. But then you might ask, why isn't step 2 CK, not pass fail? Part of this process also involves looking at the implications throughout the whole system of medicine, right? And so with step 2 CK, first of all, we do have some evidence that its use for that purpose, if used appropriately, right? Not making those 1-point distinctions, but at a much broader scale, its use within a larger context of evaluating an applicant for residency has a little more evidence to support that. And again, the effect on medical education, the system of residency, if you take away step 2 CK, then you have very few, if any, really standardized assessments that go into the residency selection process. So you can start to become worried about what might be used in its place and if that's a truly fair and appropriate process for selection. So it's complicated. I'm glad you think it's turn down maybe some of the pressure there. And I just want to be very clear that we are still very much engaged in projects that look to bring more transparency to this process, more clarity to the applicants and to their mentors, their advisors, so that there's just a lot more awareness on how these decisions are being made.
Amanda, can you talk, you mentioned this just a few moments ago about fair testing. Can you talk a little bit about fair testing opportunities?
Yes, I can. And I think it might be most interesting to walk through the way fairness is baked into standardized tests, particularly USMLE, from the very beginning. And then maybe we have some other follow-up questions we want to talk about around testing opportunities specifically. But we've alluded through this conversation to test content development. and the assessment life cycle, as it were. So let's start in the very beginning, right? Like Dan said, tests are all designed for a purpose. So psychometricians work with practicing physicians, medical faculties, stakeholders to determine what should go on to the USMLE. And from there, so let's there are more than 3 content areas, but let's just say for the sake of conversation that there are 3 and there's some sub areas within them. Then we work with subject matter experts who are, again, also practicing physicians, faculty, to train them very carefully to write test questions. So you think it's really easy to write a test question. Listener, it is not. I don't know if you've ever tried to get to a parsimonious way of assessing a very specific small thing. It's tricky. So they're extensively trained on both how to write a good question and how to write a question without bias in it. So at the first level, right, they're asked to write questions about specific areas of medical content. Secondly, those items are reviewed and edited to make sure that they can fairly assess that knowledge from examinees across backgrounds, across nationalities. My favorite example here is if you had a test question about, everyone on the 4th Friday of November is showing up to the emergency room with terrible stomach aches. What is going on? Well, if you're American, you might think, oh, that's because of Thanksgiving, something that they all just ate too much turkey. But our questions are reviewed pretty carefully to remove that sort of cultural bias and that sort of cultural assumption, which is a true avenue for fairness in our content. So from there, we have these test questions that are then placed into test forms, so groups of questions that are also reviewed by subject matter experts to make sure that they are assessing the right balance of content and that the balance is pretty comparable across each of them. You don't want folks seeing one form that seems wildly difficult, whereas one seems wildly easy. And we adjust for a lot of that statistically, both as forms are being built and on the back end. But from someone with content knowledge, you want to make sure that it looks about right. And then those forms are released into the world. Some of the items on them are scored, some are unscored. Those are called pretest items. So examinees see test questions that haven't been seen by examinees before for review. These don't go into their scores. They are completely unscored, but examinees are asked to answer them. So we can then on the back end review how difficult they were, look for any potential bias, look for any issues with the item in the wording or an image to make sure the ones that are then later included in scored positions are really doing their best work, aren't tripping up examinees, aren't too hard, aren't too easy. I think Dan mentioned earlier, it is very important to not have trick questions. One of the ways that standardized tests do their best work is by creating an opportunity for all individuals testing to demonstrate their knowledge. We want to know what you know. We're not trying to trip you up because we can't get a good sense of whether you're, in the case of USMLE, prepared to move on to the next step in the licensure sequence or enter safe and effective practice if we don't know what you know. So it's to everyone's best interest to not have any gotcha questions on the exam.
I was just going to ask so you're saying, Amanda, there are no gotcha questions in the exam. And,
no gotcha questions.
Yeah. And so if I heard you correctly, I just want to come back to something you said. Some of the questions that have been developed, you put out into the wild, meaning to be taken by test takers, but they're not scored. You're just looking to see, like, this is how we predicted maybe this question would perform. Then we're looking to see how students how the question performed with students taking in them. And then you're just using it for your own kind of research then to see, do we need to modify this kind of question for a future exam? And we
Absolutely.
have data on it. Okay. All right.
Exactly. We don't want to use questions to make decisions about examinees if we don't know they're good. So this is the way that we get questions out in front of examinees that might appear on forms in the future. Or if they're not performing well, they could be rewritten, they could be revised, or they could just get chucked out because they're not doing good work. And we want the questions that examinees see to be relevant, clear, and applicable to the right type of knowledge.
Can you say a little bit more about who some of the content, the subject matter experts are that are involved in this?
Sure, I can talk about it from the USMLE perspectives. Again, every exam's going to have different subject matter experts in that field, but I do think Amanda touched on perhaps what is one of the most surprising aspects of the assessment process, which is, how much work is done before an item ever is shown on an assessment form, an exam form, before the examinee actually sees it. And I don't know, it might be 20 or more sets of eyes have looked at an item, starting with, as we're talking about now, in the case of USMLE, these subject matter experts who are medical educators and or practicing clinicians, those with expertise, again, in the specific content we're trying to develop the item to measure. They write it. So they start drafting an item. Then it flows through a process of review from our expert test development staff, who they not only help train these item writers to follow best practices. And yes, there's a whole scientific discipline on how to write items. They help train them, then they revise these items to make sure they're not, as Amanda described, tricky, that they don't have multiple potentially correct answers, that there's not unnecessary extraneous information that might distract from the question at hand. Then the items get shown to broader committees to get an even broader perspective. And we have individuals specifically trained for bias and sensitivity review, as Amanda described as well, looking at these items. And that's all before it ever gets seen on the form. So that's before the statistical analyses that Amanda described have even happened. And then once that occurs, we have some more empirical data on, say, the difficulty of the item and how it's performing with our examinee population, those who are taking the assessments. And then it gets the determination of whether we should use this item. But to answer your question more directly, again, it's the committee. We have over 430, I believe, at this point, faculty volunteers, practicing physicians, some state medical board members, just involved in the item writing process. So those are some of the experts. And yes, they're all medical experts in the specific content area.
Let me ask you, how do you know if the assessment is meeting its goals?
In a perfect world, for a licensure test, you would have individuals who were prepared and eligible. They would test, and then you'd see how they did. And it would be evidence that your cut score was in the right place, because folks that passed were performing well and folks that failed were not performing well. But we do not live in a perfect world, because folks that fail don't get to move into practice. So we don't have that perfect evidence. But what we do have are, as Dan said, a tremendous body of validity evidence on the front end. We know our content is the right content through research and continued review. We know our items are performing well through content review, sensitivity and bias review, pre-testing, all the statistical stuff. And we know that folks, that the scores and high performers are more desirable and are very attractive to residency programs, as Dan discussed before. So the ways that we can figure out that our test is working then are through outcomes research. Once folks have been out in the field for a while, we can also look at what's called concurrent validity evidence. So are individuals receiving good feedback during their training, during clerkships or residency experiences? And does that correlate with higher scores on the tests that they've taken so far? And I'm sure there are other sources of evidence, but essentially are folks that are doing well on the exams also doing well in other places? Are folks that are struggling on the exams also struggling in other places?
I'll just say that it should be no surprise, given that we're in the field of assessment, that we then assess how our exams are performing. And so Amanda's right. We do have research empirical research that looks at how USMLE performance, in my case, right, then correlates with various other outcomes that are associated with practice of medicine. And so you're saying, hey, look, the scores on the assessment should correlate with other characteristics that show high quality medical care. And so we have outcomes showing a positive association between USMLE and, as Christian mentioned earlier, board certification performance. So those are the standardized exams to get certified within a medical specialty. We have research showing positive associations between USMLE and residency ratings and milestone ratings. As I mean, your listeners will know or soon learn are how some of the ratings occur in the residency specialties and residency programs. We have associations actually showing that USMLE higher performance is related to lower incidence of disciplinary sanctions, and some data, more recent evidence showing that USMLE is positively related to patient care, particularly lower mortality rates and lower length of stay for the patients. Now, I do want to be very clear that medicine is very multifaceted. Some other factors certainly play a stronger role than USMLE, and these associations in some of these cases are on the smaller side, but they are statistically significant, and thus they kind of provide the whole, taking all of that into account together, provides evidence that we are assessing competencies that are relevant to medical practice. So that's some of the ways we use research to show and evaluate how the assessment is performing. And if we didn't see those types of outcomes, or if we see them in certain ways that we can use that to identify maybe this is an area we need to bolster in the USMLE program.
What do you wish medical students knew about the USMLE examinations, particularly like step 1 and step 2, because that's like the ones that are right in front of them?
Yeah, I'll give a cop-out answer a bit first, but then I'll give a more real answer, which is honestly the best piece of advice I can give your listeners if they're not familiar with the USMLE is to explore the website, usmle.org, as it really does contain detailed information on each piece of the process. So the content that's assessed on all 3 exams, step 1, step 2, CK, step 3, as we described, information and guidance on certain processes like registration. There's even free sets of questions. These are more to give you a sense of the style and the type of content and to really serve as a readiness guide on how ready you are to take the exam. But they are, I think, very useful for that purpose. These are past USMLE questions that we've posted on the website. So that's my first thing that I think students should know, that there is a lot of material out there that should be very informative. I hope it is. You described, I think, really well, Christian, earlier in the conversation, the general themes that the assessments tackle. I just want to maybe say that, remember, these exams, they can't measure all of medicine. So they're built to be a representative sample of more essential tasks for what we would call undifferentiated practice, because we're not trying to cover hyper-specialized topics. We're trying to cover topics that are for pretty much anyone in any specialty should have a strong understanding of, a strong ability to perform.
You are 2 experts in assessment design and creation. What advice would you give if your child was preparing for the ACT or the SAT or the MCAT? What would be your advice to them? Would it be similar to what you just said, Dan, about go to the websites and dive into the resources they provide? Like, how would you advise or give advice to your own kid who is getting ready for one of these standardized tests?
I think what I would suggest is, in the case of medical students, is to talk with your faculty. They would know your weaknesses and strengths more than any preparation test would. And the goal of the USMLE is to assess readiness for safe and effective practice. Right? As Dan said, that's really, really broad. And you'd probably be best served by studying broadly and getting a sense from folks that know your academic strengths and weaknesses about where you might want to focus. My mother told me when I was preparing for the SAT, these many moons ago, that you shouldn't prepare because you've probably learned everything you need to know already. I don't think that's great advice in the case of USMLE because it isn't tied to curriculum. Medicine is much broader than the reasoning that was on the SAT when I took it. But I do think that broad preparation and spending some time understanding the connections between your medical school curriculum and what's included on the test would be time well spent.
Sometimes this question comes up on interview days for us at our school, and students ask us, how do we help students prepare for step one? And I've variable answers for that. But one thing I'll often tell interviewees, and you can correct me if I'm wrong or tell me this has been bad advice, but I'll tell them that no matter where you go to medical school in the United States, one of the key strategies for preparing for step one is learning how to prioritize information. Because no matter where you go, you got to go back and refresh yourself on a lot of information you've been, learning over 2 years. And so it's prioritizing what you think your strengths are versus areas you need to kind of maybe spend a little more time in brushing up in. If you've always been really good at say pathology on your pathology exams or the test prep questions you've been doing versus pharmacology, maybe you prioritize pharmacology but brush up a little bit on pathology, but really hammer away at test prep questions for, say, pharmacology. Is that good advice, or is that, Christian, you've been giving bad advice for a long time?
Christian, you've been giving terrible. No, I'm kidding. No, it's actually a really interesting topic. And I think that one is complex to address because, again, it's so dependent on the assessment you're preparing for. I think Amanda talked about it in her response to use other indicators that help you target where your strengths and weaknesses are. I think that's great advice, and that's really aligned with what you're saying here. But you have to align that with the assessment as well. So when you look at the content covered, for example, if you're preparing for step one and it highlights that you're really strong in an area that isn't assessed in step one, really that's obviously, state the obvious here, it's not going to help you. And if you're been getting a lot of feedback that you could improve in an area that's highly covered in step one, that would be an area to focus in. And again, because the assessments are meant to be broad and cover these broad domains, it's rare that focusing on a single area or even a few single areas is going to be as effective as studying across the gamut of what's covered on these assessments, which is why it's so important to look at the content covered, look at what we would call the exam blueprints, which are very specific on how much of the exam, what proportion of the exam falls into different content categories. And again, not to do another plug for the website, but that is all on the website. And then one other piece I'll mention, Amanda talked about faculty, and in most medical schools, there's specifically learning specialists that have expertise in learning design and education that can be very, very helpful. I don't know if you've had any on your show before, Christian, but that's a great resource for those preparing for any exam throughout their medical education journey.
What else? I feel like we're kind of getting near the end here. What else would you like people to know about USMLE and the NBME from your perspectives? I
was thinking about your previous question. What I wish folks that were sitting for USMLE or preparing for USMLE knew is this is something Dan said earlier, right? Everyone can pass in theory if they have the content knowledge. It is not scored on a curve. And also the cut score is not something that I, as a psychometrician, have any control over. Again, my job there and our job is as facilitators for practicing physicians who sit with us for many days and review test content. And then they help us to make a judgment about where the cut score should be. They review, we have a lot of questions out in the field at any given time. They review a sampling of them and make a judgment about where the cut score should be based on the content, which is then passed along to another governing body who makes the final decision about where the cut score is. But essentially, it is not a staff decision. It is not a USMLE decision. It is a decision made in a couple of steps by content experts, which I think really, as a person who will seek medical care, makes me feel better because I don't know anything about medicine, really. So I shouldn't be making that decision. But it does give me confidence that folks that pass do have the knowledge they need to have to be safe out in the field.
We talked offline about how the cut scores will not change every year, but can you walk us through the process?
Yeah, I think Amanda set up perfectly the overarching concept that it's the passing standard is not set by the psychometricians or even, the president, CEO of NBME or USMLE's head. It's done by individuals who are experts representing various facets of medical education, undergraduate medical education, graduate medical education, state medical board members who are involved in this process, and public members and a resident at this point as well. It's actually what we have this goes back to kind of the discussion we've been having about external input and insight. We have two governance committees that are completely external to the USMLE and NBME. They don't work for for the NBME. And so one of those governance committees is actually the one who determines the passing standard. And each step exam, to your question, Christian, is reviewed every 3 years. And just because it's reviewed doesn't mean it's changing. It's 3 to 4 years. I think we've typically been on a 3-year cadence more recently. But I just want to be clear that just because a passing standard is reviewed by the committee, they might not change the passing score needed to obtain that pass. And an example is the recent Step 1 review, which occurred last year, resulted in no change to the passing standard.
They're also not obligated to increase the passing standard, right, Dan?
Yeah, it could, the part of the review, it could increase, it could decrease, and no change, which is what we saw last year with Step 1. The other part I'll just mention, it's a very rigorous process. I know we've been kind of joking throughout that, the field of psychometrics, because it's so esoteric, there's very little known about it, I think, publicly, but there's been much research on the process of standard setting. Amanda has publications in standard setting, and it's a very rigorous process where there's different pieces of information that go into that decision, including panelists of experts in that specific content. Again, for Step 1, foundational science, we get those who are experts in foundational science actually review the items and make judgments on how minimally proficient someone, hypothetical individual who is at the minimal proficiency for safe and effective practice would perform. And so we get a wealth of data back from that panel. We also look at other pieces of information such as score trends.
That's amazing. I'm fascinated by this stuff. All the work that you and your teams put into this, and all the volunteers and people in the committees. You said up to 400?
Yeah, I think over 430-ish. I think 435 is the number I'm familiar with.
It's incredible. What would be some of your final thoughts that you'd like to share with people about whether it's standardized tests, whether it's about USMLE specifically, or general advice?
I think the real take home that I would like to share is these tests are designed to get at knowledge. We mentioned they're not gotcha questions. It's not graded on a curve. We value fairness. We value giving examinees the opportunity to learn and share their knowledge. That's what we're about as psychometricians, and it's an honor to work for a program like USMLE that is difficult and challenging, or at least perceived as such, but is reputable and I think valued by the stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that last piece really resonates with me as part of the USMLE program. The feedback, input, insight that we receive from, again, volunteer experts at pretty much every stage of the assessment development process is so essential. And it's what allows USMLE to be a high quality standardized assessment program. We talked a little bit about the research that helps us evaluate whether the exam is meeting its goals. But of course, we're getting feedback throughout every piece of this process from those who are teaching and practicing medicine every day. And that might be the best type of feedback you can get in terms of whether the assessment is achieving its goals. At least it's also a very important component. And so it's, again, a privilege to work with those individuals and support the program. And then, yes, again, for your audience, again, the best thing I think you can really do is just get a good sense of what these assessments' goals are, what they cover, and clarify, and hopefully we clarified some of these misconceptions around them attempting these exams trying to be tricky, or that it matters how others perform, or that these, the standard is constantly being raised by the organization itself. No, this is all very, hopefully people agree after hearing us that this is a very scientific and grounded, principled process.
I want to thank you too for taking a little bit of time out of your days to come and talk to us and teach us about what goes in the background of building such a high stakes examination for medical students, but also tangentially, I'm sure there's colleagues of yours that are in the other assessment areas, like we mentioned ACT, SAT, and other standardized examinations that are doing the same kind of work that you guys are doing for USMLE. So I've learned a tremendous amount, and I want to say thanks again for coming on my show and teaching us a little bit behind the scenes, what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak, for this type of examination for medical students.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity, Christian. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been great to have you. All right. Thanks again so much, Amanda and Daniel.